My friend that I'm not always on the same page with, Professor Michelle Ghetti, has turned in a red card, says she's present, would like to speak. Miss Christine Battaglia, she's also present, would like to speak. She's been very present, worked hard through all the different criminal justice committee meetings and has been present. And then Mr. Ricky Babin has filled out a red card, said he's present and would like to speak as well. He also falls into the category of my friend that I don't always agree with. Mr. Babin, are you out in the hall? All right, that said, when he makes it here, we'll go with it. But I'll turn it over to you, Miss Ghetti, and Miss Battaglia, however you want to do on the order there.
Thank you, Senator Claytor. I needed to ask because I couldn't get to anyone beforehand. Is there a way for us to get on this computer to pull up a video?
We're not going to. You got to submit that in advance so that I can see it.
Okay. All right. Just in starting.
And I'm being fair. We didn't have any handouts on the other ones as well.
Oh, well, I did have a handout.
Well, you can do. You gave me that big old book.
No.
Is that what, no. That's on something else. That's actually Judge Wicker gave me a book. I'm sorry.
Actually.
But if you hand the handout to the Sergeant at Arms, I'll take a chance to review it, and you can get going. Welcome, Mr. Babin.
Thank you, Senator.
If I could start, and Senator Claytor, I hope you've given the people who are in support of your bill an hour and a half. I
know you're fully capable of going an hour and a half, but leave some time for the others there.
Yeah, by the way, Miss Battaglia is my daughter. I know almost everyone on the committee. I'm sorry to see Senators Berry and Colomb. I hope they come back. I've worked with them on numerous bills. And, of course, I have a student. I won't mention who is my student who's on the committee. And I think know my story. Of course, all of you are sitting here, and with any trial, much less an argument, we know. I mean, I teach, and we know that the person that gets to open, the person that gets to make the argument has it easy. All they have to do is convince you of their position. The person that has to come back, the defendant, so in a case, has a much bigger task, because not only do they have to convince you of their position, but they have to unconvince you, if that's a word, of the other side. So that's, I think, where we are right now after the testimony that's been given. Just quickly, because most of you know me, but you know me in different roles, in different ways that I've been here and that I've worked with all of you in different ways. Credential-wise, I am a law professor at Southern University. I teach criminal law and procedure, among other things, and have for 26 years. I'm also on the Law Institute on the Criminal Law and Procedure Committee. I also am a former member of the Indigent Defense Board, which I was on for 6 or 7 years, a number of years back, in which I left to be on the task force to reorganize the Indigent Defense Board 10 or so years ago. So I have worked on both sides. I've also represented the state in a death penalty case that went to our state Supreme Court, and it is one of those cases that when the conviction was upheld and the death penalty was set aside to be redetermined in a new trial, and we agreed with the defense to leave that as a life sentence instead of the death penalty. But I really, although I'm going to come to you professional and with my background in that, I would just also mention that I wrote the bench book, or helped write the bench book that all of the judges use in capital trials today. I've also written the materials used to teach the course I created, which is called Anatomy of a Murder Trial. And I teach the judges through the Judicial College every single year about all the criminal recent developments, but death penalty in particular, and I've done that for probably 20 years now. So every year for 20 years, I read every single death penalty case, both here in the state and at the national level with the Supreme Court. All of that being said, and I will come back around to that, really what I'm here for today is as a survivor and family member of murder. Had an attempted murder by my former husband on me and survived that with my daughter being 2 at the time, literally fled in the middle of the night to come back to Louisiana, the only way I could have been safe. I've certainly felt, as I can't remember now, someone said, if that person came up to me today, I would shoot him. And I know that because I spent 3 days in the hospital and 2 days in a hotel with my parents after this happened to me. And the next thing I did the next day, especially after running into him in a grocery store because he was still free, and him threatening my 8-year-old son at that time, was buy a gun, and carried it with me for years. I couldn't sleep by myself for many, many months. In fact, until I moved back to Louisiana. This all happened in Dallas, Texas. So I have been a survivor of an attempted murder. And the victim didn't get too many consequences from that, to be honest. Unfortunately, because maybe if it had been taken care of at that time, the more heinous crime would not have been committed. We did move on with our lives here in Louisiana, and he remarried. I'm sorry. It's going to be hard for us. He remarried, but continued with his domestic violence. He had 2 little girls with his second wife, whose name was Mary Jean Pearl. When those little girls were 6 and 9, to get back at their mother, he brought them to his loft in Dallas. He called, he had the oldest little girl, Faith, call her mother on the phone and put it on a speakerphone. And while the mother listened on the speakerphone, and while Faith, the 9-year-old, asked her not to file charges against her daddy, and then when Mary Jean said, "Stop, John, please don't do this to the girls," she heard Faith say, my daughter's sisters, Faith say, "Don't, Daddy, don't, please don't." And the next thing the mother heard were the shots. And she listened and then screamed, "Run, girls, run." And the younger girl, the 6-year-old, ran. We know because her body was found feet from the door to try to get away from her father, who, while the mother listened, shot both of the girls with one gun in the back, severing their spinal cord so they couldn't run any further, and then got a second gun and went up to each of them, put the gun to their head, and shot them through the head. He then, over the speakerphone, said, "Merry effing Christmas, Mary Jean," and left and went and met up, locked the door so no one could get in, then went to a bar. Went and took some drugs, picked up a girlfriend, went to a bar, left a big tip, went next door and had 2 roses tattooed on his arm for the girls in barbed wire. He also called the answering machine at his ex-wife's home and left a long message that was played at his trial, where he'd said very creepily, "Girls, I know you're in a better place now that you don't have to have anything to do with your effing mother." He was apprehended later that night. The mother called me really in the middle of it before she had even gotten up to see the girls, because she had to get there and call the police. She thought of us and was concerned that he may have left to come down to Louisiana to try to kill the 2 of us. If I'd been able to pull up the videotape, there has, there's been a book written about this, and the girls' last statements. It's in its 2nd edition now, required reading in my view, for anyone that is in a domestic violence situation. And by the way, I didn't mention I'm also on the board of the local domestic violence center, or just recently resigned from that. So we've lived through that. Christy was 15 at the time, and these were her little sisters, 9 and 6, and her father who committed the crime. So she's going to, if she can, if she wants to, she of course has a choice, but she wanted to be here today. She has a very unique perspective because she lost her 2 sisters to a murder. So she's a family of 2 victims. but it's also her father, who today sits on death row in Dallas, Texas, in Huntsville, which we're still waiting on. Last year, in March, his execution date had been set, and the two of us literally sat on my bed in my bedroom waiting for his execution at 6 that night. We learned through Facebook, because we had friends in Dallas, that the execution had been stayed. We just lived through this last year. The execution was stayed because he is now trying to say that he's incompetent to be executed. So for the last year, we went back to the trial court, and I'm going to email each of you this video clip, because it's really something you need to see. He went back into the trial court with a hearing and a sanity commission, and had 4 psychiatrists, 3 of whom said, yeah, we think he's incompetent. He's now trying after 16, it's been 16 years. 16 years. Next week. It'll be the anniversary of the girls' deaths and of the trial next week. 16 years. 15 years since the trial. He's trying to say now he's not even sure that he really killed the girls. And this happened about 2 years ago. He started to take that position. And maybe he's being set up and he really doesn't have a memory of it and things like that. 3 of the psychiatrists said they thought he had some, I'm trying to think what they called it, that people were against him, out to get him, syndrome of some kind. One of the psychiatrists who the court had appointed and who has worked in prisons for many years, said, oh, he's just making all this up. He's very smart. A documentary was made of this, which was shown in Canada last night. So for the documentary, he was interviewed 2 weeks before his execution date and about 3 or 4 weeks after the execution date, and was very clear. You could very clearly see. And one of the things that I wanted was shown in this little trailer clip. The documentarian asked him about what he did to me and did he have any regrets of what he had done to me. And he said, yeah, that I didn't kill her. She's a pain in the butt. Now, he's sitting on death row in Texas right now. If he were on death row here in Louisiana, I would be facing that this man who still, after 30 years when we were married, 20 years, 16 years after killing these 2 girls, the main thing he's thinking of right now is getting out to kill me. And I lived with that for all the years between when it happened, when he attempted to kill me, until he was put in prison, and that felt freedom for the first time then. What you guys are doing, and not only this legislation, but the probation and parole legislation, at least as it was filed, is also consider giving parole to lifers. So should his sentence, if you get rid of the death penalty, he would get a life sentence. And now under your proposed legislation, he would get out. And I would have to continue to be, and she would have to continue to be victimized by that, because that's the alternative that you're offering. Everyone, no matter how horrible their crime, will be given a life sentence. And if the probation and parole recommendations made by the task force go through, those people will be up for parole. And if the parole board's decision last November in that Alexandria case is an example of that, released after what they did. I'm going to let her talk. I think she's at a point where she can talk now a little bit about how it feels to be a family member of little girls that were killed, and also how it feels to have your father on death row for all this time.
Thank you, Ms. Ghetti. Ms. Battaglia, and take as much time as you need.
First, for all the other family members of victims in here, I do, as you were saying before, some of you don't know what it feels like. I do. I can speak for the family members of the victims. But I'm also in the unique position that I'm the family member of the offender as well. The there are always those two sides. They're not usually the same. And I will tell you, from 2002, everything happened in May of '01. And as my mom said, the trial was in 2002. So from when he was convicted and sentenced till middle of last March, when he was about to be executed, I would have been testifying on the other side. I could not, I totally agree with I don't understand how we're going to tell people not to kill people by killing someone. That totally made sense in my head. Then I started learning about other aspects of that it's not so black and white. Yes, killing the offender does not bring closure to the family. There is no closure. Nothing is going to bring back faith and liberty. What I got closure, if you want to call it that, when I forgave him. A lot of people don't understand how I could do that. It took a long time. It's probably about 4 years ago. And as other Christians will tell you, forgiveness is for yourself, not for the other person. I've never said to him, I forgive you. I don't know if he knows I forgive him. I don't know if he knows I'm mad at him. But I did that on my own. What he did still hurts me. I'm sad every day. I will never see my little sisters. Aside from that aspect of it, he took himself away from me. His choices, he made that decision to also leave me without a father. And the mental anguish of being a teenager with your dad on death row. But like I said, I forgave him for what he did. I still love my dad. He is my dad. A lot of people don't understand that. I don't think I could ever explain why I do. My stepmom, Faith and Liberty's mom, actually told my mom she wanted to have nothing to do with me anymore. We kept a relationship after everything happened. I went to visit her. I was going to go to college at SMU and live with her. A few weeks after I went to visit, she told my mom she didn't want anything to do with me anymore because I still loved my dad. So that there is that part of me that I love my dad, and the thought of him being executed kills me inside. I would never wish that on anyone. I mean, those of you who are a family of victims, compound that. I can't even describe it. I have, for 16 years, prayed that he would die in prison of anything before they could execute him. However, I am confident that if he had the chance to not be in prison anymore, then I probably wouldn't be here. Because, like my mom said, I'm not a parent, but for those of you who are, he knew that the worst way to hurt Mary Jean wasn't to kill Mary Jean. It was to take away the girls. I know, like my mom said, they've been apart for 30 years. That he's been in prison for 16. And all he wants to do is hurt her still. I am positive. I've been to visit him. I am positive that his hatred for her tops his love for me. He sent me this was my Christmas card. He sent me this past Christmas. That said, I hope you are having a merry and fun holiday and not wasting any more of your time and karma trying to do your old dad in. That only puts you on Santa's naughty list. Time to get on the nice list. If not, then just go to law school and assure yourself a place in hell for all eternity. Referring to my mom being a lawyer. Either way, I still love you and always will. That is why I saved you from your mother and why I named you Christy. And then, a little PS part, make sure you go to Christmas services too. Making you a Catholic was the only end of the deal your mom kept. So keep up the faith. Faith is written in all caps and underlined, as that was one of the names of my sisters. Like she said, they did this documentary, and when the director asks him, when he thinks back on the time when he put my mom in the hospital 30 years ago, what does he think? And my dad's response was, well, it makes me think I should have killed her. So, yes, some people change. I do agree that being in prison, some people turn their lives around. But that means fix the system, not the end result. And a lot of people say the system doesn't work. That I agree. There are people that are wrongly convicted. Any of the multiple reasons that anti-death penalty people are arguing that way. Fix the system. Don't fix the reason they are wrongly getting put on death row in the first place. There are people that don't change. Like I said, if the death penalty didn't exist, if he were going to get life without parole, but then somebody changes it to being able to get parole, I'd be living in fear. I was just thinking, I have a neuromuscular disease. There is no treatment, no cure, so I currently participate in drug trials. If they were to ever find a drug that was a treatment for what I have, but it had side effects, I would take the drug and figure out how to deal with the side effects, not say, I don't want to deal with it. You fix the between if the end result helps.
Thank you, Ms. Pataglia.
Senator Claytor, can it come back? Because I was just letting her speak while she could. I wasn't finished with what I wanted to say. Because I'd like to speak, not just my case, but for the other victims, if I could.
Okay. I'm just trying to allocate the time. How much more time do you think you're going to go?
10 minutes, 15 minutes at the most.
Okay. Mr.
I think
Babbitt?
it's important, though.
Well, yeah,
that
it's
these
all important.
The victims
Absolutely.
need a voice here.
Nobody's saying they don't have one.
Even Senator Coloma.
Nobody is saying that they don't have a voice here, Miss Ghetti. You know that. So go right ahead.
What I handed out, has it been distributed to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, I put together, because obviously I can't read about this.
Yeah.
These are the men.
I'm going to interrupt you for a moment. Just want to give the audience and you some information on Senator Colon. She's been ill. and been ill for a while, has some balance issues. She's in the ante room continuing to listen and holding on. So it's not that she's not being respectful of the process. She's being a trooper and hanging in there as best she can.
I know we've spoken often because she's also a survivor of a family murder.
All right.
And Senator Barrow and Colomb have helped me so often with the domestic violence stuff. So
yeah, and Senator Barrow's tending to Senator Colomb. So
no, I'm sure. So
all right, so go ahead.
Anyway, what I've given you is the list of the people, the men and one woman who are currently on death row in Louisiana, because I think it's important. And I mean, I do this when I teach these cases to judges or speak about them anywhere, because usually what happens is a lot of what we saw happen earlier today. We get all up inside our heads, you know, and it's interesting to me, the prosecutors are dealing day in and day out with the victims' families. But it's interesting to me how it seems like, even as a prosecutor, as you get away from having to deal with the rawness of what actually happened in their families, that you forget, I think you forget about the gory details and what are actually done. So these 72 people that are currently on death row in Louisiana, this is not any kind of common crime. These crimes, if possible, are either equal to, in one case, or more heinous than what happened to us. So let me look at the list, and a lot of these are from Baton Rouge, where most of you are from, and a lot of these are domestic violence, family violence related. You might look at and they're listed from the most current to the longest away from that. But you might look at Brian Horn. These involve children. Mr. Horn, who's sitting on death row right now, he is a twice convicted sex offender. He smothered a little boy who he lured away from his friends by a text message acting like he was a little girl. The little boy then met him and was smothered to death by this man who had been previously convicted as a sex offender. Marcus Reed killed 3 people, the Adams. These 3 brothers, the oldest of which was an honor student at Southern University, were ambushed in their car in the driveway of Reed's girlfriend. Reed had been hiding in the woods and came out shooting with an SKS assault rifle. Allegedly, this was over an Xbox that had been stolen from him. All 3 boys were found hanging in different positions out of the car as they had been assaulted with this assault rifle. If you look at Mr. McCoy, he murdered the parents of his estranged wife, and her 18-year-old high school honor student in Bossier City. The mother had fled and was in a witness protection program in another state because of the domestic violence. The 18-year-old boy had gone to live with her parents to finish out his senior year in high school, where he was a stellar student and athlete, and the ex-husband murdered the parents and murdered the 18-year-old son. Lamont Tucker is on death row here. He and his accomplice beat Tucker's ex-girlfriend, who was 5 months pregnant at the time, to death. Beat her to death. She was also an honor student at Southern University in Shreveport, and they dumped her body in a pond somewhere and wasn't found for 3 days. Jeffrey Clark is the Angola 5. So when you talk about deterrence, and although it doesn't seem like it's deterrence, I mean, deterrence is a factor for the death penalty in prison. In the prison situation, and you've got a bunch of lifers in there, the death penalty is the only deterrent, arguably, to them, because it's the only thing that can be worse than already spending their life in prison. And it is something that is talked about within the prisons as actually having a deterrent factor at that level. Darian Kuhn beat to death his girlfriend's 2-year-old son. The child was beaten so badly that he had 75 wounds to his body and lacerations to his liver and kidney, among other injuries. Mr. McGee shot his wife
Professor
and son.
Ghetti, I understand, and we've got this. You do understand the bill doesn't affect one of these, correct?
No, I don't agree with that. I heard that said. I don't agree with that.
Well, it's got an effective date moving forward, so you disagree with that.
I disagree with that because, number one, if you abolish the death penalty, you're saying that we are abolishing the death penalty, but we're still going to put to death the people that are on death row?
Correct.
The courts will never uphold that.
All right.
Courts
If
are
that's
not
your
gonna
argument,
uphold
that's
that.
fine. We can have a disagreement on that.
Yeah, but they're not, if we find the death penalty to not be what we want in this state, they're not going to let us move forward. They're going to end up
Well,
leaving all
we can
these
disagree
people
on that, but go ahead. I
arguably
was
in
just trying
solitary
to
confinement.
figure that out.
I just want to point out, though, I mean, these people, these are 70, no, they're more than 72 because most of these are multiple murders. Hundreds of people. We talk about the victim being the defendant here. We're talking about killing an innocent man. If you look at the very end of what I've given you, between 2000 and 2015, if you want statistics, there were 8,415 murders in Louisiana. All right, there are 450 to 500 murders every year. Those are 450 to 500 innocent victims that did nothing wrong that are put to death in this state every year by murderers, some of whom are sitting on death row. But if we want to talk about innocent people being put to death, we're looking at not even one a year, arguably, that might have been an innocent defendant that might be put to death or be at risk of that, versus 500 people that are unquestionably not with us anymore, and they were innocent victims. Only 32 of the 8,415 murders in this state, only 32 received the death penalty. Only 32 of 8,415 murders, only 32 people received the death penalty. We're not like on some big spree of killing people as a state institution. That is less than 1%. In fact, it's 0.003% of the people who receive the death penalty in the state. Is it expensive? Yes, it is. I was on the Indigent Defense Board. We know that. But for everything that all of the people that testified earlier today say, I have a couple of responses, if I could. I know that those of you, Senator Mills, I know because I read a quote from you in the paper, Senator Clater, I know for you too, especially with the Catholic Church and the Catholic bishops, they've come out strongly and have forever against the death penalty. So there were, I don't know if there is another religious person that is is against the bill, but what I wanted to point out was scripturally, it's very clear. I mean, God intended for there to be the death penalty from the very, very beginning. From Genesis, Exodus, I mean, I have 5 pages of citations and quotes. I know, Senator Clater, you don't want to hear this, but I'm just saying.
No,
I want to be able to meet the religious argument, if I may, please, because I know it's very
You're
persuasive.
welcome to do it. I use the new book, not the old book myself, but go ahead.
Well, I use both books because the old books tells me God said, you know, and Jesus is God's son.
Fire away.
Okay. All right. Exodus, God said, but it goes to the whole theory of the death penalty. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. That's at the very beginning of the Bible. That's when Moses came down with the 10 Commandments. Senator Clay, I don't know if you still follow the 10 Commandments then.
I
Jesus
try,
said to
and
follow
I'm going to
it.
start stoning adulterers next. I mean, we can find everything else in there, but
Right.
keep
Well,
rolling.
Jesus, though, said that the old law had not died. And in when Moses came down, God told him to tell the Israelites, anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, God lets it happen, they are allowed to flee. God even set up sanctuary cities, if you will. He instructed that those should be set up so people could flee if they did not intentionally kill another person. The unintentional death, people responsible for those could flee to a sanctuary city until they could have a trial. And the whole thing was that people should have and are allowed to get justice one-on-one. Not even with a trial, one-on-one, where an intentional murder was committed. If anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. And I can read about 20 or 30 more scripture citations that say it over and over and over and over again, all the way through Proverbs, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then you do get to the New Testament. And I thought, well, what does Jesus say about this? Well, in Matthew 15:4, as Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees and distinguishing between human rules and God's rules, he cites the death penalty. I'm trying to quote it right here, that anyone who curses their parents should be put to death. Those are Jesus's words, citing back to Exodus and Leviticus, that anyone who curses his parents should be put to death. Jesus is telling the Pharisees that's the way it should be. That's God's law, not man's law. Peter recognizes valid reasons for the death penalty in Acts. Paul recognizes them in Romans. Paul again in Romans says that, and again John in 1 John recognizes it again. So it was, I would argue, created by God. It was created by God as a remedy because he recognized the human heart and he recognized that the need to get justice when you had someone taken from you in that manner. And he gave sanctuary to those that did not commit a deliberate act of murder. So, I would just mention that. I would also tell you that the Supreme Court recognizes that the death penalty is only for two reasons, and that's deterrence. And it's also, I just lost my place in here.
Keeps them from
Vengeance,
doing it again.
But I don't like to use that word vengeance, but I have it written down. But what they said is it is an expression of society's moral outrage at particularly offensive conduct, which is essential in an ordered society. It is essential in an ordered society that asks its citizens to rely on legal process rather than self-help to vindicate their wrongs. The death penalty was set up so that people will not take the law into their own hands. And I can tell you as one, it's very tempting to do that, especially when you can't believe in the system. If the government and the system is not going to do that for me in the way it's supposed to be done, following the rules and following the law, people will take it into their own hands. And I believe you see a rise in that right now because people don't trust the system to take care of that issue. As far as it being a deterrent, and again, from the United States Supreme Court, Gregg versus Georgia, there is no way to know whether it's a deterrent or not. For the people committing murder, obviously, it's not a deterrent for those number of people. But for the people who are choosing not to commit murder, how do we know? How do we know that they're making a choice to maybe rob without having a gun with them? I have read cases where someone has said that. Didn't bring a gun, or brought a gun and didn't have any bullets in it because I didn't want to kill anyone and I didn't want to face the death penalty. Someone mentioned that they read in a district court. It was actually justices currently, just a couple of years ago, Justices Ginsburg and Justice Breyer, our two most liberal justices on the court, which are not pro-death penalty, but who said that a firing squad would be possibly the better remedy. I want to say basically what my daughter said earlier, although we didn't talk about this, so it's interesting. For me, you don't have to do away. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, although that's maybe not a good term to say in this context. Fix it. There are numbers of ways that it can be fixed. All these cases that they're being brought up to you and all of these statistics, those cases are at least 20 years old or older where this happened. The prosecutor mentioned when he was back prosecuting, and one of the other people that were talking about the cases that are 20 or 30 years ago, we didn't have the indigent defense system that we have today. We didn't have the rules that require two lawyers for any person accused or facing the death penalty so that they have adequate representation. You're not finding inadequate representation cases today. About the two problems you have today are Brady violations and Batson violations. And yes, Brady violations, which is the violation of discovery rules where the prosecutors aren't turning evidence over, still exist. I would suggest to you only in one, maybe two jurisdictions, but one in particular, that's still happening. There's a remedy for that, and I've been screaming it at the judges for years and years. The prosecutors need to be disciplined for that. They're not being disciplined. I wrote a whole article on it. On the John Thompson case, I wrote a whole article about that. No, you get a slap on the hand and you move on. There is nothing motivating a prosecutor to show all the evidence. We could pass a law that says we have open discovery in all death penalty cases. Prosecution must turn over their entire file prior to trial, and that would do away with the Brady violation part. As far as the Batson violations, if you want to fix a Batson violation, which is a kicking someone off the jury for racial discrimination, do away with peremptory challenges. Some states have done that. I mean, it's a radical idea, right? But don't allow peremptory challenges at all. Either you're challenged for cause or you're on the jury in the order that you get picked. That solves that problem. Those are the two problems that exist today. Those are the only two I could find in the last 20 cases that cause people to be convicted wrongly, let's say. You can fix this. You don't have to throw everything away. As far as a lot of the statistics that were given, I mean,
Professor
I have to take
Ghetti,
issue with that.
You said you would go about 10 more minutes 15 minutes ago. I do want Mr. Babin to have an opportunity, and any of the others out there. I've permitted you to speak the longest out of any of the group. Can I give you 5 more minutes to wrap up?
I'm good. I'll leave it there.
Okay, Ms. Battaglia, do you have more that you would like to offer? Okay, I appreciate it. You want them now? Okay. Senator White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's Dr. Ghetti?
Professor.
Professor Ghetti. Should we pass this legislation, which doesn't apply to the 72 people on death row? Have you seen a judgment rendered in the last 50 years that said it was where the Supreme Court commuted all death penalties to life?
Well, not in that many years. I mean, obviously in the 70s that was done.
Well, it's
and
40 years ago.
Reinstituted, right?
Okay. It's in the last 50 years.
I don't believe that issue's come up at all to the court
Okay.
where they've commuted all, just broadly all sentences.
Well, I think that it would come up and that there would be a judgment rendered that would commute all these sentences.
I would think very possibly. Certainly it would give evidence to support the case in Louisiana. I mean, you'd have a further, I mean, there are already arguments that are being made against the death penalty, particularly in Louisiana, on a jurisdictional basis, in that if you could commit the same crimes in 2 different jurisdictions, and this is not just Louisiana, but everywhere, and for example, Shreveport and Alexandria, not just picking, you would get the death penalty in Shreveport and you wouldn't get it in Alexandria, so that it has not persuaded the Supreme Court yet on that, but it has been mentioned in the dissents that there's some inequity in the death penalty because of that. So I would say it's very possible that the court could come in and say, now going forward, you have made a determination by your legislature that the death penalty is immoral, is not good, is too expensive, whatever reasons the record will reflect from here on out. And those reasons apply equally to the people sitting on death row. And you're now letting people go forward, commit the same crime, and not receive the death penalty, whereas these people sitting on death row can be put to death. I don't know. That would be a new issue brought to the court.
Right. I think it's another cause.
I can see where the court is going on. I mean, it's a 5-4 split on the court right now for the most part. So, yeah.
All right. That's all for now.
It would also be against the trend right now.
Okay.
I mean, California is passing laws to allow executions to go forward. California, our most liberal state, California that usually leads and is on the point of the spear, is currently, literally right now, passing laws and trying to overcome their Supreme Court to allow their executions to move
I
forward.
think Nebraska just had a vote in November too, didn't
They did, and of course Arkansas executed 2 people the first time in I don't know how long 2 people were executed on the same day in Arkansas. So the trend is in the opposite direction.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Senator White. Senator Perry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Ghetti, on the face of the bill itself, would you agree that the language itself would not affect those who have previously or who are currently on death row, just on its face, not about what could potentially happen, but on the face of the bill, it does not address that.
It doesn't appear to. How it's interpreted, I'm not sure, but on the face of the bill, it appears to be
Prospective.
not retroactive, but prospective. But I mean, because that's the language used in the
Okay.
bill, as I remember it. I don't have it in front of me. That it's prospective and not retroactive. But I'm not sure how that's going to be interpreted.
Okay, so so you would say yes.
Yes.
Okay, so which leads to the second question. Not in great detail, but give an example for everybody to understand. If this would become law, what would be the steps of maybe somebody currently on death row to be, I mean, would it just be a part of moving forward their appeal process saying it's not fair to us, that type? I mean, because that's going to be a big issue that a lot of people
Well,
are going to talk about.
Yeah, for most, my defense attorneys are behind me, I presume still, but for most, there will be no one answer for the 72 people currently on death row because they're at all different stages of the process. So those that, and I don't know how many, they would know better off the top of my head. The list is there. I would say back to even as 10 years back, probably at least, they're still in either the appellate or the post-conviction stages. And at appellate stage, they would raise it as an appeal part, as they almost always. I mean, in any death penalty case, defense attorneys, list 50 different reasons to set aside the conviction, and that would be one of them. Usually one of them already listed is that the death penalty is unconstitutional, and that would be their argument, that this is now even more unconstitutional than we're going to argue it was anyway because of this inequity.
So more than likely, they would bring up those arguments whether the bill passes or not. My whole point of bringing it up is just to be clear that the bill is not retroactive currently as we sit here, this date, this time. I want to make sure that's clear. Okay.
Well, that's, yeah. I mean, that's for you guys to make clear.
Right.
I
Thank
can
you.
only give an opinion on it that would have to be tested.
Thank you, Senator Perry. Senator Mills?
Thank you so much for your testimony, both of you. Say from your argument, if this would pass, and I see people have been on death row since '86, are there any way the courts can let them out?
Yeah, I mean, if they ruled that the passage of this somehow would apply retroactively to them, they would. I don't know. Well, it depends on what ultimately happens with the probation and parole bill, I would suggest, because
But no, just this bill itself.
Yeah.
Just this bill itself.
I mean, this bill would do nothing but remove the death penalty going forward as a choice in sentencing. Right, that's what I understand the language of the bill to do. It removes the death penalty as a choice. And I would also real quickly say on that, I mean, as far as fixing it again, I agree it's too broad. We keep adding aggravating factors to the death penalty statute, to the first degree murder statute, and I've been saying for years we've gone too broad and they need to pull it back in. But yes, so the statute itself means going forward that's not a choice the jury has any longer in this state. If the court would come in and say that somehow affects the people sitting on death row, that we've made a choice that the death penalty is not something we want to have in this state. Because, I mean, the thing is, it's a little bit different from a regular situation because although we're saying we're not affecting their sentence, the death penalty is an actual act, right? So you're going to do it. You're going to execute the person in the future. Their sentence is whatever is that they are to be executed. We're deciding here in this session, perhaps, we're not going to execute people in this state anymore. Then how do you turn around and execute someone from back there? Because you're doing away with the death penalty and saying we're not going to execute people.
And my last question, from your expertise, from your spreadsheet, I see there's people on death row that just were on death row in 15, and I see in 1986 on your last page. Why is somebody still on death row in 1986? That that was sentenced since 1986. Why is that?
My answer to that would be, as they noted, we haven't executed anyone since 2004 other than Mr. Gerald Bordelon,
Right.
who, luckily for his family, because he raped and murdered his stepdaughter, if you remember, those of us here in Baton Rouge, that was a local crime. And he thankfully took himself away from continuing to harm the family and make them live through that. But the reason for that, I mean, could be any number of reasons. I don't know. I don't absolutely personally know the answer to that, but I would believe we've had a lot of litigation over the last 10 years over the actual execution protocol and how it's to be done. We've had 2 cases in the last 10 years from the Supreme Court on that, which has upheld the protocol in both situations. We also have had the manufacturer of one of the 3 drugs used in the execution. The manufacturers of the drugs don't want their drugs to be used for executions, and so they're not selling them anymore. So there's been a scramble to find another way to do that. In California, you can read about that, is one of the states kind of leading the charge on that. They've come up with a 1-drug protocol. And so it may be another couple of years before that's approved by the courts. And obviously, states are hesitant to do something if the courts haven't said it's okay to do that. So that's my opinion, that we've had this delay for the last 10 years because we haven't wanted to move forward with that protocol until we were sure that we were doing it the right and most humane way.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank
Thank
you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Mills. Professor Ghetti, Ms. Pataglia, thank you for coming. If I was rude to you in any way, I apologize. Sometimes we get a little bit combative, but my friends that we deal with all the time. So thank you for coming and presenting the other side of this argument.